The conversation that I wanted to have today could have turned into something really long, but I'm going to keep it very, very philosophical. And the reason being is that it is the topic of race and consent. And I chose this topic. I have my own self-serving reasons, which is that I really wanted to kind of force myself to start getting into the mindset because I'm going to present on it later on on behalf of NCSF later on in October. Also, this is Consent Month. And with it being Consent Month, it is such a robust conversation that people start to have. I was going through recently looking at blogs of people, and they were actually talking about consent and race, consent being a Black woman, consent in that all that it entails. But I think it's important for the board, since a big piece of our focus is consent, for us to maybe start having the conversation on a level that is more based in an individual's history, the history of this country, looking at systemic racism and how that has impact the concept of consent as it relates to the Black community. And that's what I wanted to focus on today with this diversity moment. And the way that I wanted to look at it is look at it from the angle of decolonization, liberation, agency, permission, and the giving, receiving, and witnessing of consent. And when I'm talking about decolonization of consent, I'm talking about it from the angle of how it has been socially constructed historically, economically, politically, how consent has been constructed from that angle, from those who are positioned in power, and how it has been constructed in a way to reserve that power. And I want to put that up against the concept or the construction of race. This is not going to be a presentation about historically looking at where race came from or how race was developed, but it's important to understand that race in itself, the concept of race and how we see it today, and the narratives around people's skin, ethnicity, national origin, et cetera, is based upon having power over. So we think about consent in the way of how it's constructed in those in power protecting it, and those in power taking liberties and the ability to actually give or even participate in a conversation on consent away. And I'm talking about specifically within the Black culture, just real brief a little bit, when we think about how race was constructed or the Black person's experience, we were rooted in a look at us as not being human, positioning us socially within the class in a way that we don't have voice. We were used as an economic resource. It was about exploitation. So the idea of negotiation, the idea of gaining permission, the idea of do you want to participate with that was not present. You can even extend that to women, you can extend that to children, but just that idea of how all of it has been constructed is rooted in taking away and having power over and preserving the power that you have. And that's the angle that I'm coming from. Additionally, as an individual that looks at us reconnecting with the idea around consent, when I'm thinking about with my clients now, right? I work a lot with individuals who have trauma in their past, and I work a lot around racialized trauma. It's about liberating from those ideologies of actually what it looks like to live robustly, fully free. And the idea of being fully free, and the idea of people actually, asking you for permission and not being so entitled to your experience, to your body, and to yourself. That whole idea around living in a place to where you have a new relationship with consent, you have a new relationship just with restructuring and removing that narrative about who you are as an individual, and then fighting against that narrative. Just that idea of liberating from that philosophically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally is quite liberating for many people. And that's the idea, that's the angle that I'm going to be coming from when we get further into the conversation. And the next piece that I'm going to be looking at is around agency. And agency is necessary with consent. To me, it is absolutely paramount that the individual actually has the capacity and the capability to either to give consent to somebody, and that other person actually has the capacity and the capability to receive whatever that person's response is, be it a no, be it a yes, be it an I don't know. Agency is very important in that conversation. And so when I was talking about when and thinking about race and thinking about the narrative, when I am in negotiation, I'm going to talk about negotiation, the vehicle of it. When I am in negotiation with another woman of color, when I am in negotiation with another man of color or another just person of color, be it brown, be it black, or someone who is Muslim, someone whom is Jewish, someone whom is even white. I consider all of the narratives of the skin that they're in. And I lead with that because I recognize that in this country that I live in, I recognize that the narratives that we live in dictate our ability to give, receive, accept, or even witness the experience or the negotiation with consent. And I think that's important to consider, being in that if you are an individual and I'm in negotiation with someone who is another white person, they may view me different. They do view me differently in the way of, do they view me in the way of intelligence? Do they view me in the way of trust with violence? Am I inherently this type of person based upon the narrative that you have about who I am, and I consider that in the negotiation, and the way that I consider it in the negotiation is that I call it out in the negotiation. And in teaching that to people and having a conversation and being able to call it out, it allows them to be an ally within that relationship in the negotiation. Allyship, it does not leave room for being complicit in anything that is inherently, there's a power differential when it comes to race within it. And I think that's important to be able to do, even if it's you're negotiating with another Black person. As being a Black person, I think it's important to call out, and I do all the time with gender, and I encourage people to do that. And I think that's an important aspect of us to include in challenging based upon our history, because a lot of our history is based upon the sovereignty that we have and that we hope to have as individuals. And a way to practice that sovereignty is to mitigate all power differentials and challenge all power differentials based upon negative narratives that we have about another group, based upon race, based upon gender, based upon anything. Another thing to look at, in addition to sovereignty, which is what I have up here, is to recognize that within this country, a part of the narratives that's going on in the world we have right now around masks. It's about our rights as individuals. And in this country, we have had to build into our Constitution. We have had to build into civil rights amendments. We have had to build into various statutes and legislation giving rights to people where historically it was about taking the rights away. And having and recognizing and presuming that the person sitting across from me has the same civil liberties, the same civil rights as I have. A part of practicing that is acknowledging that there's evidence within historically, and there's also evidence that could be in the space in between us that challenge those perceived civil rights. There's something going on currently right now within the Fort Worth area around individuals whom are 21, 22 years old, who are negotiating within scenes and with individuals who have 30 years age difference with them, and they're viewed as children. They're not even given the same or equal standing in conversations and in negotiations. So how can you fully give consent if you don't see this person as an equal across from you? And that's a big part of the conversation. when you're negotiating, how do I see this person? Do I see this person as someone who has equal rights as I do, deserving of equal rights as I do? And that also gets into values. A big piece around consent is taking a look at the values of what has shaped and what has created us as a country historically, what has shaped us around race, additionally, when it comes to the value of what a Black person is. You know, is this person that's sitting before you, do you see them, do you believe, or do you step into the narrative that this individual is a part of society that is dangerous? Are they seen as someone who has a contribution, someone who has something to offer within this engagement that we have within negotiation? What do they have to offer? What am I hoping to get from this particular relationship? And this takes me to the book, The Color of Kink, and looking at their entire conversation around sovereignty and around consent. One of the things that a lot of people struggle with, they mentioned Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, they mentioned a couple of other individuals talking about sexual freedom, is that, is it truly possible in a BDSM dynamic to have a truly authentic conversation where full consent is given untarnished with the history that we have in this country? And that's a really interesting conversation that people have in master slave dynamics and et cetera. From the use of the collar, it's a real interesting conversation. I encourage you to go and read about it. And as a community, we have to recognize when we talk about creating a consent culture, are we challenging those power differentials that could lead to coercive relationships? Are we teaching in consent classes that there are things to consider historically in this country where it can be inherent and entrenched systemically, that there is this power differential where consent could be challenged or could not be fully given? Another big one is fetishism, talking about race, especially the capitalistic nature of it, looking at fetishism and how are we getting into these relationships for exploitation in itself, but then it gets into some people want to be fetishized. So you to have those conversations, and it's okay to have those conversations. I know many sisters I sit across from and have conversations like, I enjoy being fetishized. I enjoy being worshiped. I enjoy being this. I'm like, hell yeah, you know, but going into and knowing exactly what that is and calling it out is really important. And the equity of it is the accessibility of having these conversations around consent, around race, and around whatever needs to happen to where we are, there is a particular class or a particular group that is not the dominant culture, where historically there has been differences in being able to give consent, receive consent, or witness consent. So that was very fast, but that was some of my musings and some of my thoughts around consent and race for this diversity moment.